Perhaps the most famous incident of spy going on within the United States was that of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were related to a gentleman who worked as part of the Manhattan Project, and as such, they had access to the sensitive information of the development of our nuclear and atomic energy programs. So, Julius and Ethel were accused of providing Russia with secrets from the Manhattan Project. Worldwide protests are going to break out on their behalf. Lots of people said that there wasn't enough information, or because they were Jewish people, there was some racism involved. There was a whole lot of scandal behind it, and not a lot of evidence, mostly circumstantial. Regardless of this fact, they were both executed by an electric chair in 1953, despite worldwide protests. So people at this point began to realize, we were really serious about not wanting communism, particularly within our own borders. The Internal Security Act was also passed in 1950, which is kind of like the Patriot Act after 9/11. This required that, if you were somebody that we deemed to be possibly of a group that might be a risk, you had to register with the federal government. So there were known people who belonged to the Communist Party within the U.S. They weren't necessarily spies, they just had been communists. They were required to come before the federal government and say, hey, I'm a communist. This made it difficult for them to find jobs. They were blacklisted. However, if we found out that you were a communist who didn't register, you were also blacklisted. So it was really, really difficult, as a catch-22 where you really couldn't win. In addition, people from countries that were considered communist countries could not migrate to the US very easily. So it was really just this huge era of paranoia and fear. Here you can see the Ethel and Julius Rosenbergs before their execution. The most rampant example of anti-communism within the US is probably the Joseph McCarthy, what we call the witch hunts, the Red Scare witch hunts of McCarthyism. He was a senator from the state of Wisconsin. In 1950, he claimed that he had in his possession a list of communists who worked at the State Department. He refused to ever produce this list. He just said, oh, he had it, he had it. He had all this evidence and all this proof of all these people who were allegedly communists who worked within the US government. And if you went against him, if you said, no, you don't, well, then it made you look guilty. And if you said, well, then yes, you do, then it made him look more powerful. So once again, it's a catch-22 where it was really hard to win in this situation. Using this, McCarthy was able to become exceptionally powerful within the Senate, and he was able to basically wage war against anybody that he considered to be a communist sympathizer, but eventually that's going to turn into just anybody he didn't trust in general. He would just randomly flat out accuse people of being communist. Lucille Ball was one of these people, the star of the I Love Lucy television show. And he claimed that he was protecting America. He's like, I'm actually looking out for our well-being. And if you're a patriotic American, you've got nothing to fear. He had no evidence, but he was able to single-handedly destroy the reputation and career of hundreds and hundreds of workers across the country. He was rather popular with more conservatives within the country, however, because they saw it as, look, somebody is taking a stand, somebody is making sure this country is safe, let's go ahead and support him. Furthermore, many people within Congress feared crossing him because they thought that they might lose their jobs. Margaret Chase Smith is going to be one person, however, who is going to stand her ground. She's going to issue the Declaration of Conscience, and what it does is it supports anybody who went against McCarthy by flat out condemning him. She said, if you support McCarthy, you are a horrible person, basically, to paraphrase. And the trick about it and how she got around it without getting herself in trouble was that she never directly said his name. She basically said, I am opposed to people losing their individual liberties in the fear of communism. Very few people dared join her, however. Even President Eisenhower refused to comment because as soon as you did, McCarthy would just say, well, you're against me because you're for communism. So a lot of people turned a blind eye, and McCarthy was able to do whatever he wanted. And he did this for several years. In 1953, the arts start to speak out, most famously through playwright Arthur Miller. He's well-known, writer of different works of plays, and his most famous in this time was called The Crucible. And The Crucible was allegedly about the Salem witch trials of the 1600s, where people just out of flat-out paranoia were accusing each other of being witches. Well, it was an allegory for what was going on during the time period where people were flat out accusing each other of being communists. And the allegory was pretty blatant, so anybody who read The Crucible knew that Miller was actually criticizing those who supported McCarthy. McCarthy, nonetheless, a year later, started leading his raids against the U.S. military, and he put these on televised debates. He would often badger the witnesses. He was very aggressive in his questioning, very bullying, and he started to look really bad. And so as public opinion turned against McCarthy, they watched these and they watched him just go at these people nonstop. Public opinion turned against him, and he was officially condemned by the Senate by a vote of 67 to 22. So really, for about 4 years, McCarthy was able to destroy the reputations and careers of lots of people based on hearsay or circumstantial evidence, but his far, far too aggressive tactics, once seen by the American people, really limited his strength. Even more frightening than the communist scare at the time was the ever-present fear of the nuclear attacks. As I said, the US and the USSR were engaging in an arms race to try to build the most advanced weaponry possible. In 1950, the US began work on the hydrogen bomb, which is considered 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bombs that were dropped in Japan. We first dropped our H-bomb in 1952 in the middle of the Pacific Ocean on an abandoned Pacific island, and that island was completely vaporized. Obviously, the water was also somewhat polluted. A couple months later, Russia realized that in order to combat us should the need arise, they needed to have their own H-bomb, so they're going to build one just as powerful also. And this is going to result in a back and forth of the two nations trying to build the biggest and best weapons possible. In schools, children were taught duck and cover drills, where, if lights blinked, the students, this was their test, they had to run and get under their desks real fast, so drop and cover under the desks. And there was a whole bunch of civil servants, public service announcements, and cartoons to try to teach the kids how to do these drills. In reality, getting under your desk is not going to do anything in case of an atomic or nuclear bomb going off. However, the idea was that it was supposed to make the kids feel slightly safer and to make it seem like there was a chance of survival. Some schools went so far as to give their kids dog tags that if there was a nuclear attack, they would at least have something to identify the bodies after the fallout. In reality, these duck and cover drills and this being drilled in your head nonstop, the threat, the ever-present threat of nuclear violence, really is going to lead to a fear that exists within these children into their early adulthood. Don't, trust the Russians, that type of mentality. Many people were so scared that there was also a huge revival in terms of religion. At this point they said religion is the only cure because nothing else is fixing this, so we better start praying. So there were a whole bunch of evangelists who gained power. Evangelists are just those people who go around and, they preach the gospel, usually trying to raise money. The most famous of these was Billy Graham. He had thousands of listeners who would tune in each week to listen to him saying, hang in there, God will save us in case of a nuclear apocalypse and those types of things. There was also an increase in the number of churches built. The Pledge of Allegiance was modified to include one nation under God. In God we trust was added to coins. So the fear of Armageddon is going to blur the lines of separation of church and state. In addition to calm fears, the government is going to create a whole bunch of pamphlets and videos on how to survive an atomic attack, how to survive a nuclear fallout. And again, they were woefully ignorant by today's standards. They didn't understand or know all the information, but again, it was just to allay fears. Lots of people were encouraged to build backyard bomb shelters or nuclear fallout shelters in order to survive the blast, as they put it. And there's great movies that are all about this. Blast from the Past is the most famous. So, these were all just efforts at trying to make people feel better, even though in reality they weren't going to accomplish very much. Um, the arms race is going to go hand in hand with the space race, where the space race is going to be to try to use the inner space to spy on each other, to build weaponry, that type of thing. So in 1957, a group of Americans are going to create what's known as the Sane Nuclear Policy. And this was a committee that issued a report that urged the United States to increase negotiations with Russia to end nuclear tests to decrease nuclear pollution. We were truthfully scared. Hey, you know what? We're playing with this technology that we don't know really well. We probably shouldn't play with it because who knows what might happen? Who knows what the lasting effects are? We didn't know how bad Hiroshima and Nagasaki were going to be. Do we really want to mess with stuff that's even more powerful? Nobody really listened. In terms of the space race, like I said, the goal was get to outer space so we can have that area for, if we need to have an escape route, if we need to spy on each other, if we could maybe launch some form of missiles from outer space. So there's lots of motivations behind the space race. And so then the question becomes, well, who won the space race? Well, in 1957, the USSR is going to launch the world's first satellite into orbit, and it's called Sputnik. So for many people, the fact that the Russians were the first one to successfully put something into orbit in outer space, the Russians win the space race. However, we are going to be the first to land on the moon, allegedly, depending on the conspiracy theories. And so if that's what you consider a finish line, then we win the space race. But there's a whole bunch of different advances. They release a satellite, so then we release a satellite. They put a dog into space, Laika, so then we got to put something into space. They put a human, Yuri Gagarin, into space. Okay, now we need to make one orbit. And so we were constantly just modifying, okay, what's the finish line? How far can we go? In order to help us become more successful with our space race goals, President Eisenhower is going to turn to Congress, and they're going to create an organization known as NASA to help with this aim of space exploration. And NASA stands for National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Within 1 year of NASA being created, we are going to create our first satellite that is able to successfully orbit, and that is called Explorer 1. That same year, Eisenhower is going to have the National Defense Education Act passed, which sets aside millions of dollars to enhance math and science education in everyday schools, with the ultimate goal of creating a more competitive, scientific group of people for generations to come in order to make sure that we retain supremacy at all times.